There are moments in life that split you into two people. The person you were before, and the person you become after. For me, that moment came wrapped in butter sauce and candlelight, at a table for 12, in a restaurant so expensive that the menu didn't even show prices next to the seafood tower. I remember the exact second it happened. My mother's voice, sweet as sugar, sliding across the table like a knife wrapped in silk. "Sweetheart, you'll get this one, won't you? You're doing so well for yourself. I want to tell you my name doesn't matter. What matters is what happened to me, because maybe it happened to you too. Maybe you've sat at a table, literal or otherwise, and realized, all at once, that the people who were supposed to love you the most were the ones planning to use you the hardest." My name is Claire. I was 31 years old the night my whole family sat around a table and ordered $4,000 of lobster, wine, and truffle everything, and decided, without asking me, that I would be the one to pay for it. But before I tell you about that night, I need to take you back further. Because betrayal like this doesn't happen in a single evening. It's built, brick by brick, over years, until one dinner simply becomes the moment the whole structure finally shows itself. I grew up in a modest house on a quiet street, in a modest town where everyone waved at everyone and nobody's business stayed private for long. My father, Robert, worked in insurance, steady, cautious, a man who balanced his checkbook by hand even after online banking made it unnecessary. My mother, Linda, stayed home when we were young and, later, worked part-time at a boutique downtown, though what she lacked in income she more than made up for in opinions. She had opinions about everything: my clothes, my hair, my career, my relationships, and eventually, most permanently, my money. I was the middle child. My older brother, Daniel, was 3 years ahead of me, golden in every way that mattered to my parents, charming, athletic, quick with a joke that made the whole room laugh, and somehow, always, forgiven. My younger sister, Mia, was 5 years behind me, the baby, the one who never had to ask twice for anything, the one whose tears could end an argument before it began. And me? I was the one in the middle, in every sense of the word. Not old enough to be excused like Daniel. Not young enough to be protected like Mia. I was the one who filled the gaps. The responsible one. The fixer. The one who never, ever said no. I don't think anyone sat my family down and assigned us these roles on purpose. I think it happened the way most family patterns happen, quietly, invisibly, one small moment at a time, until one day you look up and realize the pattern has hardened into something that feels less like a role and more like a cage. I remember being 9 years old, the year Daniel broke our neighbor's window with a baseball and blamed it on a stray dog that didn't exist. My mother believed him instantly, laughed about it later at dinner, called him creative. I remember being 10, watching my father quietly slip Daniel money to replace something he'd broken, no lecture, no consequence, just quiet, unconditional rescue. Meanwhile, when I forgot to feed the dog one evening because I'd been absorbed in a book, I was reminded of it for weeks. Not cruelly. Just constantly. As if my mistakes required correction in a way Daniel's never did. I remember being 12, the year my mother first called me the responsible one in front of relatives, her hand resting proudly on my shoulder like I was a prize she'd won rather than a child she'd raised. I remember how good that felt, how, for a 12-year-old starved for a particular kind of attention, being called responsible felt like being loved. I didn't understand yet that I was being handed a job. I only understood that I had found the one thing that made my mother look at me with pride, and I clung to it with everything I had. There's a specific memory I keep returning to, one that I think, looking back now, was the true beginning of everything. I was 13. It was a Saturday, and I had been saving money from babysitting for nearly 4 months to buy a bicycle I'd seen in a shop window downtown, a deep green one, with a wicker basket, nothing extravagant, just something that was entirely, completely mine. I had almost enough. My mother came to me on a Thursday evening, sat on the edge of my bed, and told me, in the softest voice imaginable, that Daniel needed new cleats for baseball tryouts, and that our family just didn't have the extra money that week, and would I mind terribly lending him what I'd saved, just until payday? I said yes. Of course I said yes. And Daniel made the team, and wore those cleats proudly for 2 seasons, and never once mentioned the bicycle I never bought, because he never knew about it in the first place. My mother never mentioned repaying me either. The subject simply evaporated, the way so many things involving my money would evaporate over the following 2 decades, as though the asking itself had been generous enough, and the repayment was a technicality nobody needed to remember. I didn't buy that bicycle. I rode my old, rusted one for 2 more years, until I outgrew it entirely. I never told anyone how much that moment cost me, not financially, though it did cost me financially, but in some deeper, more permanent way. It taught me, at 13 years old, that my wants were negotiable in a way that other people's needs simply weren't. It taught me that being a good daughter meant being willing, cheerfully, to disappear. By the time I was 16, I was the one who managed the family calendar, who remembered birthdays before my mother did, who mediated arguments between my parents when things got tense, who helped Mia with her homework because our parents were too tired after work to sit with her themselves. I wasn't just a sibling in my family. I was infrastructure. College was supposed to be my escape, and for a while it almost was. I studied finance, drawn to numbers because numbers, unlike people, didn't lie to you, didn't change the rules halfway through, didn't need you to read their mind. I worked 2 part-time jobs throughout school, not because my parents couldn't have helped more, but because Daniel's tuition, unofficially, always seemed to take priority. He was figuring himself out, changing majors twice, and someone had to cover the difference when the loans didn't stretch far enough. I never resented him for it outright. I resented, quietly, the assumption underneath it, that his uncertainty deserved funding, while my certainty simply meant I didn't need help. I graduated with honors, landed a position at a respected consulting firm in the city, and for the first time in my life, I had something entirely my own, a career, a paycheck, an identity that had nothing to do with being anyone's fixer. It didn't take long for my family to find a new use for that identity. I was 26 the first time my mother asked to borrow money, $1,200, for a car repair, paid back within the month, she promised. I said yes without hesitation, because saying yes was the only language of love I'd ever been fluently taught. The money was never repaid, not really, $100 here, quietly forgotten there, but I told myself it didn't matter. Family helps family. That's what I'd been raised to believe, and believing it made me feel, briefly, essential. That first loan opened a door that never quite closed again. Over the next 5 years, the requests came steadily, each one wrapped in just enough urgency to feel impossible to refuse. Daniel needed help covering rent after a temporary rough patch that somehow lasted the better part of 2 years. My parents needed help with a roof repair, then a car repair, then a surprising number of medical bills that never seemed to align with the insurance my father supposedly had through his job. Mia needed tuition help, then rent help, then help covering a deposit on an apartment she couldn't actually afford on her own. There was a particular Thanksgiving, when I was 28, that I think about often now. I had arrived early to help my mother cook, as I always did, and found her on the phone with my aunt, laughing about something. When she hung up, she mentioned, almost as an afterthought while stirring gravy, that she'd told my aunt I'd be happy to cover the cost of the family's annual New Year's cabin rental that year, since you're the only one who can really afford it comfortably. I hadn't been asked. I'd been informed, the decision already made, my agreement simply assumed as a formality that didn't require my actual presence in the conversation. I paid $1,100 for a cabin I used for exactly 2 nights, surrounded by relatives who spent the weekend drinking wine I'd also, somehow, ended up purchasing. I gave, and gave, and gave, and here is the part that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. Not once, in 5 years, did anyone in my family ask how I was doing. Not financially, not emotionally, not in any way that suggested they saw me as anything other than a resource that happened to also attend Thanksgiving dinner. I told myself a story to make this bearable, the way we all do when the truth is too painful to sit with directly. I told myself that I was strong enough to give without needing anything back. I told myself that being needed was its own reward. I told myself that one day, when it mattered, my family would show up for me the way I had always shown up for them. I got a small preview of how untrue that story was about a year before the lobster dinner, when I went through a difficult breakup after a 4-year relationship ended abruptly. I called my mother the night it happened, shaking, barely able to speak clearly. She listened for about 10 minutes before gently steering the conversation toward Mia's upcoming move, mentioning that Mia could really use my help that weekend if I felt up to it, once you're feeling better. I spent that weekend, 2 days after my heart had been broken, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs for my sister, who thanked me by ordering pizza for herself and her friends and forgetting to save me a slice. I didn't know yet how wrong my story about my family truly was. I wouldn't know until the night everything finally came into focus, under warm restaurant lighting, over a table piled with lobster I never asked for. The dinner that changed everything was supposed to be a celebration, my father's 60th birthday. My mother had been planning it for months, dropping hints for weeks about somewhere special, somewhere the family deserves, somewhere memorable. I offered to help cover costs, the way I always did, because offering was second nature to me by then, an instinct as automatic as breathing. That offer, innocent as it seemed, was the crack in the door that let everything else through. She chose a restaurant downtown, a glass-walled place overlooking the harbor, the kind with a 6-week waiting list and a sommelier who greeted guests by name. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease when she insisted, almost too casually, that I not worry about looking at the menu prices beforehand. "Don't worry about that, sweetheart, just come and enjoy your father's birthday." I buried that unease, the way I'd buried 100 small warnings before it, because acknowledging it meant confronting a truth I wasn't ready to face. The night began beautifully, I'll give it that. My father looked genuinely happy, laughing more freely than I'd seen him laugh in years, telling old stories about his own father, about the early years of his marriage, about a version of himself I rarely got to see. Daniel arrived 20 minutes late, as always, with a new girlfriend on his arm, ordering champagne before he'd even properly sat down. Mia arrived in a dress that likely cost more than my monthly rent, spending most of the night photographing the food for her social media rather than actually being present in the room. Aunts, uncles, cousins filled the private dining room with noise and laughter, the kind of noise that, from the outside, looks exactly like love. I sat near the middle of the table, doing what I always did, smiling, refilling water glasses, translating unfamiliar menu terms for my father, who squinted at words like beurre blanc and crudo with the same confused suspicion he gave to modern technology. For a few hours, I let myself believe this was what family was supposed to feel like. I let myself relax into the warmth of it, the lights, the laughter, the illusion of belonging. But what I didn't know that night was that somewhere between the toast and the second bottle of wine, my mother and my aunt had already quietly decided how the bill would be handled. I didn't know that Daniel had told the waiter, with an easy grin and a wink, "Just keep it coming, my sister's got this one." I didn't know that this dinner, this celebration, had already been decided, without my knowledge, without my consent, without so much as a passing conversation, to be mine. The lobsters arrived first. Not one per person, but towers of them, stacked high on ice, glistening under warm amber lighting. Then came the wine, bottle after bottle, each pricier than the last, selected by my uncle who fancied himself a connoisseur despite, as far as I knew, never having owned so much as a wine fridge. Side dishes nobody had ordered appeared and vanished half-eaten. Dessert arrived as a full production, a cart wheeled to our table because, as my mother put it, we should try them all, it's a celebration, after all. I watched the night unfold with a slow, nameless anxiety building in my stomach, the kind you get when some part of you already knows something is wrong before your mind is ready to admit it. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself this was simply a happy night, that my family deserved this indulgence, that my discomfort was a flaw in me rather than a warning worth heeding. Until everything changed. The waiter approached the table near the end of the night, carrying a small leather folder, his eyes scanning the group until they landed, unmistakably, on me. My mother, without missing a beat in her conversation, without so much as glancing up, said the words that would replay in my mind for months afterward. "Just give it to Claire, sweetheart. She's got it." The table didn't pause. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody objected. My father didn't say, "Wait, let me see that." Daniel didn't reach for his wallet. Mia didn't even glance up from her phone. It was as though the entire table had already rehearsed this moment, as though everyone had been told the ending of this story except me. I opened that folder with hands that had gone strangely cold despite the restaurant's warmth. $4,012. I stared at the number so long the waiter shifted uncomfortably beside me, unsure whether to wait patiently or quietly retreat. Around me, the laughter continued uninterrupted. My aunt was mid-story about a recent cruise. My cousin was asking Mia about where she'd found her dress. The world kept spinning while mine had just, quietly, catastrophically, stopped. I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment, because I suspect some of you already know it intimately. The feeling of realizing, in one single devastating instant, that everyone at a table has silently agreed to something about you, without you, an agreement built entirely on the assumption that you would simply accept it, the way you always had, the way you'd been trained to. I looked around that table at every face I had loved for my entire life, and for the first time, I truly saw them. Not as the family who had raised me, who had shaped me, who I had believed, on some fundamental level, needed me. I saw them as people who had learned, patiently and thoroughly over years of my silence, that I was a resource to be managed. A bill to be quietly assigned. A yes that never needed to be asked for aloud, because it had always been assumed. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I sat very still, and I felt something inside me, something that had been slowly bending for 31 years, finally, quietly, begin to crack. "I'm not paying for this," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, steady enough to cut cleanly through the noise of the room, steady enough that conversations around the table began, one by one, to falter and stop. My mother laughed first, a small, dismissive laugh, the kind she used whenever she wanted the room to believe I was joking, even when we both knew I wasn't. "Don't be silly, Claire. It's your father's birthday." "I know whose birthday it is," I said. "I didn't order $4,000 of lobster and wine, and I'm not paying for it." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. And what none of them knew, what I barely understood myself, sitting there with that leather folder still open in my trembling hands, was that this dinner wasn't the beginning of a betrayal. It was the culmination of one that had been unfolding for years, one favor, one loan, one just this once at a time. What I also didn't know, not yet, was that the next few months would force me to confront not only what my family had done to me, but what I had allowed to happen, and what I was finally, going to do about it. The car ride home that night was silent. My father sat beside me. I had offered to drive him home, a small mercy neither of us mentioned out loud, staring out the window instead of at me. I kept waiting for him to say something. An apology. An acknowledgement. Even a simple, "That wasn't right of your mother." Instead, when we pulled into his driveway, he patted my hand gently and said, "You know how your mother gets. Don't make this bigger than it is." As if I was the problem. As if my refusal to be quietly robbed was the disruption, rather than the robbery itself. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake replaying the dinner over and over, searching desperately for the exact moment I could have stopped it, the moment I should have seen it coming from further away. And the truth, when it finally surfaced somewhere around 3 in the morning, was worse than I expected. I had seen it coming. I had seen it coming for years. I simply hadn't let myself believe it, because believing it meant admitting that my family's love for me had always, quietly, come with conditions I had never agreed to. The days that followed became an education in exactly how deep this pattern went. My mother called first, not to apologize, but to explain, in the tone she reserved for moments she considered perfectly reasonable, that family helps each other, and that my behavior at the restaurant had embarrassed her in front of relatives. She didn't ask how I felt. She told me how I should feel, guilty, apologetic, ready to make amends by simply paying the bill after all and moving on as though nothing had happened. I refused to answer her the way I always had. Instead, for the first time in my adult life, I asked a question I had never dared to ask before. Mom, how long have you all been planning for me to pay for things without asking me first? There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words even arrive. It's not like that, Claire. You've always been so good at handling these things. We just assumed. You assumed, I repeated slowly. You didn't ask. You assumed. She hung up on me. My own mother hung up the phone rather than sit, even briefly, in the discomfort of what she had just unintentionally admitted. That's when the real betrayal began to unfold, piece by piece, like a wound that keeps revealing itself the deeper you press into it. I called Daniel next, mostly out of habit, mostly because some small, stubborn part of me still hoped one member of my family would take my side, would see what had happened for what it was. Instead, he laughed. Actually laughed, the easy, careless laugh that had gotten him out of every consequence for his entire life. Come on, Claire, it's not that deep. You make good money. We don't. It's just how it works. It's how it works because I've let it work that way, I said. That doesn't make it right. Whatever you say, he replied, and I could hear him already distracted by something else on his end of the line, already finished with a conversation that required nothing from him but 2 minutes of mild irritation before he moved on with his evening. I felt something break a little further that day. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet, internal fracture, like a bone that had been slowly cracking for years finally giving way under one more small, ordinary pressure. Mia was the one who hurt the most, because Mia was the one I had protected the longest, the most fiercely, the most quietly. I had covered her rent twice when she was between jobs, no questions asked. I had paid for her car repairs without ever mentioning it to our parents, because I didn't want her to feel judged the way I sometimes felt judged. I had driven 4 hours once, in the middle of the night, because she'd called crying after a breakup, and I had never once made her feel like she owed me anything for it. When I called her about the dinner, hoping, foolishly, desperately, that she of all people would understand, she sighed instead, the particular sigh of someone deeply inconvenienced by another person's emotions. It was one dinner, Claire. Why does everything have to be some huge thing with you? I sat with the phone pressed against my ear, and for the first time, I let myself truly hear what she was saying beneath the words. To my family, my boundaries weren't boundaries at all. They were inconveniences. My feelings weren't feelings. They were obstacles to be managed patiently until I calmed down and returned to being useful again. Around this time, something happened that I didn't expect at all, something that ended up matching more to this story than I initially realized. My Aunt Carol, my father's older sister, a woman I had always liked but never felt particularly close to, called me out of nowhere, about 10 days after the dinner. I assumed she was calling to lecture me the way everyone else had. Instead, her first words were, "I heard about the dinner. I want you to know, I think you did the right thing." I sat down slowly on my kitchen floor, phone pressed to my ear, stunned into silence. Aunt Carol told me something that night I hadn't known before, that she had watched a similar pattern unfold in her own life, decades earlier, with her own sister, my father's other sibling, before a falling out that had lasted almost 15 years. Your grandmother used to say the same thing to me that I imagine she said to you, Carol told me gently. That the people who really love you never make you feel guilty for saying no. I didn't listen soon enough. I want you to listen now, while you're still young enough for it to matter. That conversation didn't fix anything on its own. But it did something important. It reminded me that I wasn't imagining this, wasn't overreacting, wasn't the villain of a story where I had simply, finally, stopped being convenient. Someone outside the immediate tangle of my parents and siblings had seen the pattern clearly, from a safe distance, and confirmed what I already knew in my bones to be true. I spent the following weeks in a strange, quiet grief for a family I had thought I had, grief for a version of myself who had believed, for 31 years, that being needed was the same thing as being loved. I went to work every day and functioned, because that's what people like me do. We function, even while breaking apart inside, because breaking down openly in front of others has never once felt safe to us. I remember one evening in particular, about 2 weeks after the dinner, sitting alone in my apartment with the television on for noise I wasn't actually watching, staring at my phone, at a family group chat that had gone unusually quiet since the confrontation. I remember feeling, for the first time in my life, genuinely alone, not because my family wasn't around, but because I finally understood how alone I had always been within that family, surrounded by people who loved the version of me that gave endlessly, and had no interest in the version of me that might, eventually, need something back. But grief, if you let it run its course honestly, has a strange way of clearing space for something else to grow. In the emptiness it left behind inside me, something sturdier slowly began to take root. Not sadness anymore. Clarity. I started remembering things I had buried under years of forced, automatic forgiveness. The Christmas I quietly paid for everyone's gifts because my mother claimed the family budget was too tight that year, only to discover weeks later, through an offhand comment from my aunt, that she'd spent that exact amount on a spa weekend with her sister instead. The time I lent Daniel money for a business opportunity that turned out, months later, to be a trip to Cancun with friends he never once mentioned to me directly. The cabin rental I paid for that New Year's, used for 2 nights and never once acknowledged. The birthday dinners, the holiday dinners, the endless string of just this once dinners that had somehow, over the span of a decade, become an unspoken, unacknowledged tax on simply existing within my own family. I pulled up my bank statements one night, something I had actively avoided doing for years, because some small, self-protective part of me had already known, on some level, what I would find there. Being a finance person by trade, I did what I always do when emotion alone can't fully explain something. I built a spreadsheet. I documented every loan, every just this once, every dinner, every bailout I had quietly funded for my family over the past decade, methodically, line by line, date by date, working past midnight into the early hours of the morning, watching the number climb steadily higher with every entry I added. The number that appeared at the bottom of that spreadsheet made me sit back in my chair and stare at the ceiling for a long, long time. It wasn't just $4,000 from one dinner. It was over $62,000, given freely, asked for casually, and never once acknowledged, let alone repaid, across 10 years of my life. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't only anger, though anger was certainly present. It was shame. Shame that I had allowed this to continue for so long. Shame that I had mistaken my own quiet exploitation for closeness, for belonging, for love. Shame that somewhere along the way, without ever intending to, I had trained the people I loved most to see me not as a daughter, a sister, a whole person with my own needs, but as a resource with a pulse and a bank account. But underneath that shame, something sturdier was slowly forming. A decision. Because here is what I finally understood, sitting alone with that spreadsheet at nearly 3 a.m, I could keep grieving the family I had believed I had, or I could start building boundaries for the family I actually had. I could keep hoping, endlessly and fruitlessly, that they would change entirely on their own, or I could make change unavoidable through my own actions. I thought, that night, about my grandmother, who had passed away when I was 22, the one person in my family who had never once asked me for anything, who instead used to tell me, gently but firmly, Claire, the people who truly love you will never make you feel guilty for saying no. I hadn't fully understood what she meant back then, young as I was. I understood it now, in the sharpest, most painful way possible, sitting alone in the quiet of my apartment with a spreadsheet full of a decade's worth of proof. I decided, in that moment, that I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cut anyone off dramatically, satisfying as that particular fantasy felt in my mind. What I was going to do instead was quieter, and far more effective in the long run. I was going to stop being invisible in my own life story. I was going to make sure that the next time my family sat down at a table assuming, without asking, that I would pay, they would learn, in a way they could never again pretend to misunderstand, exactly what I was worth, and exactly what I was no longer willing to give away for free. I didn't know yet, precisely, what that would look like in practice. But I knew, with a certainty I hadn't felt in years, that it was coming. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, instead of dreading the next family gathering, I found myself, quietly and almost nervously, looking forward to it. The plan came together slowly, the way real, lasting change usually does, not in one dramatic burst of fury, but in a series of small, deliberate, consistent decisions, each one building on the last. The first thing I did was stop being the family bank. Quietly, without any grand announcement, I began declining every request that came my way over the following month. When my mother texted asking for a little help covering a plumbing bill, I replied simply that I wasn't able to help right now. When Daniel mentioned, casually, in the middle of an unrelated conversation, that he was a little short for rent, I told him I hoped he'd figure it out, and left it there. No lectures. No dramatic speeches. Just a quiet, consistent no, delivered without guilt, without over-explaining myself, without apology of any kind. You would be amazed how loud a simple no sounds to people who have never once heard it from you before. The second thing I did was harder, but necessary for my own sense of clarity. I gathered every piece of evidence of the money I had given over the years, the bank transfers, the receipts, the text messages where family members had asked for help and thanked me, in writing, at the time it happened. I wasn't building this for a legal case, or even to confront anyone with it directly at first. I was building it for myself, proof that what I remembered had actually happened, proof I could hold on to the next time someone tried to convince me I was overreacting, misremembering, or simply being dramatic about the past. There was one moment during this process that I still think about often. I found, buried in an old email folder, a message Mia had sent me 4 years earlier, thanking me for covering her deposit, ending with the line, "I promise I'll pay you back the second I'm stable. You're literally the best sister in the world." I sat with that message open on my screen for a long time. Not because it made me angry, though it did, somewhere underneath everything else. But because I could see, so clearly now, exactly how the pattern worked. The gratitude was real in the moment. The promise was real in the moment. And then time simply passed, and the debt quietly dissolved into the comfortable assumption that it had never really mattered in the first place. Not to her, not to any of them. The third thing I did was the one that mattered most, and it happened 3 weeks after the lobster dinner, when my mother called to invite me to another family gathering, my cousin's engagement party, hosted, once again, at an expensive restaurant she had chosen without consulting a single other person about the likely cost. "You'll come, won't you?" she asked, her voice deliberately light, as if the previous conversation between us had never happened at all. "I'll come," I said. "But I want to be clear about something first. I'm not covering anyone's bill this time. I'll pay for my own meal, and that's it." There was a pause on the line, the kind I was slowly learning to recognize as the sound of my mother quietly recalculating her strategy in real time. "Of course, sweetheart. Nobody expected you to." We both knew that was a lie. But I let it sit there between us, entirely unchallenged, because I no longer needed her to admit the truth out loud to feel secure in it. I only needed to know it myself, clearly and completely. The night of the engagement party arrived, and I walked in with a different kind of calm than I had ever carried into a family event before. Not the anxious, performative calm of someone desperately trying to keep everyone else happy, but the quiet, settled calm of someone who had finally, permanently stopped auditioning for a role she had never actually wanted in the first place. Before we sat down, I quietly pulled the waiter aside and let him know, clearly and privately, that I would only be responsible for my own meal that evening, regardless of what happened at the table later. It felt strange, almost illicit, to plan so deliberately for a dinner. But it also felt, for the first time in years, like taking care of myself instead of simply hoping someone else would. Dinner unfolded much as it always had, lavish, careless orders, laughter that didn't particularly include me in any meaningful way. My uncle ordered a bottle of wine that I happened to know, from experience, cost nearly $300. My cousin's fiancé, clearly trying to impress the family, ordered a round of appetizers for the entire table without checking with anyone. I watched it all unfold with a strange, detached calm, no longer anxious about where the bill would eventually land, because I already knew, with total certainty, that it would not be landing with me. When the check arrived this time and the waiter, out of habit or perhaps quiet instruction, moved instinctively to hand it toward my end of the table, I simply slid it, calmly, toward my mother instead. "This one's on the family," I said, smiling pleasantly. I already covered my share separately with the waiter earlier. The look on her face in that moment was something I will remember, vividly, for the rest of my life. Not quite anger, something closer to genuine disbelief, the very specific disbelief of a person realizing, in real time, that a tool she had relied on comfortably for years had, without warning, quietly stopped working. My father, to his credit, was the one who finally broke the tense silence, pulling out his wallet with visible, obvious reluctance. "I suppose it's on us then," he muttered, and for the first time in years, I watched my family actually reckon, even briefly and imperfectly, with the real cost of their own long-standing choices. I watched Daniel and my uncle awkwardly split the remainder between them, watched Mia quietly slide a card across the table for the first time I could remember at any family dinner, ever. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody stormed out. But something small and important had shifted, quietly, in that room, and everyone at that table felt it, even if nobody said so out loud. But the true climax of this story wasn't that particular dinner. It was 3 days later, at a smaller, quieter gathering, just my parents, my siblings, and me, at my mother's specific request, to talk things through properly. I suspect she expected, at minimum, an apology from me. What she received instead was the spreadsheet. I laid it calmly on the table between us, no raised voice, no tears, no dramatic flourish. $62,000, fully documented, carefully dated, entirely undeniable. I watched my father's face change slowly as he read down the list, the loans, the bailouts, the birthdays, the cabin rental, the endless dinners, each one a small piece of a decade-long pattern none of them had ever before been forced to confront laid out in painful, complete detail. "I'm not asking for this money back," I said, into the stunned silence that followed his reading. "I'm showing you this so that you understand, clearly, what I've given, freely, for years, without ever once being asked whether I could, or genuinely wanted to. And I need you to understand that it stops now. Not because I don't love this family, but because loving all of you can't keep costing me my future, my savings, and my own self-respect." My mother tried, briefly and predictably, to argue, insisting I was exaggerating the situation, that family simply doesn't keep score in that way. I told her, gently but with a firmness she had never heard from me before, that I wasn't keeping score in order to punish anyone in the room. I was keeping score because for years, I had been the only one who didn't get to see the full picture clearly, and pretending that picture didn't exist wasn't fairness toward anyone. It was simply convenience, theirs, and never mine. Daniel, surprisingly to me, was the first to soften noticeably. Maybe because he was the one who had taken the most over the years, and some small, long-buried part of him already, quietly, knew it to be true. "I didn't realize it added up to that much," he said quietly, staring down at the spreadsheet rather than at me. It wasn't a complete apology. But it was, undeniably, the first genuinely honest thing he had said to me in years. Mia cried, which surprised me more than almost anything else that entire night. Not performative tears for effect, but real ones, the kind that come only when someone finally sees themselves clearly, honestly, and doesn't particularly like what they see reflected back. "I always just thought you didn't mind," she said softly. "I never really thought about what it actually cost you, every time, to always be the one who supposedly didn't mind. I won't pretend that one difficult conversation fixed an entire decade of deeply worn patterns overnight. Families rarely heal completely in a single dinner, no matter how honest that dinner manages to be. But something real shifted in that room that particular night, a genuine crack of acknowledgement appearing in a wall that had stood, entirely unquestioned, for years and years. In the months that slowly followed, things didn't magically become perfect, but they did become noticeably different. My mother, for the first time in my entire adult life, began asking me directly whether I was able to help with something, rather than simply assuming I would. My father started quietly correcting Daniel when he made careless jokes about money at family gatherings, something he had never once done before that dinner. Mia paid me back, slowly, in small increments, not because I had ever explicitly asked her to, but because she wanted to prove, to herself, I think, far more than to me, that she was genuinely capable of it. Even Aunt Carol, who had called me that night weeks earlier, told me at a smaller family gathering that spring that she'd noticed the shift too, that whatever I'd done, it had rippled outward further than I'd probably realized. I still show up to family dinners. I still love my family, complicated and deeply imperfect as they are, and likely always will be. But I show up now as someone with real boundaries firmly in place, someone whose yes finally means something, precisely because my no is now, at long last, allowed to exist freely alongside it. Here is what I have come to understand fully, in the year since that lobster dinner quietly changed everything for me. Love that only ever flows in one direction isn't really love at all, it's an arrangement, carefully dressed up in the comfortable language of family so that it never has to honestly explain or justify itself. And the people who benefit the most from your prolonged silence will almost never be the ones to break it first. That difficult, often lonely work falls, nearly always, to you alone. If you're the one in your own family who always pays, always fixes, always says yes because saying no feels, somehow, like a form of betrayal, I want you to hear this clearly and completely. Setting a boundary is not the betrayal. Being quietly used for years, and calling it love simply because no one ever taught you the real difference, that is the actual betrayal, and it is one you have every right, whenever you're ready, to finally bring to an end. I didn't get my revenge that particular night by embarrassing my family publicly, or by cutting them off in some dramatic blaze of anger. My revenge, if you can even accurately call it that, was simply this: I stopped disappearing. I started existing, fully and visibly, at that table as a whole person with real worth, rather than merely a convenient wallet that happened to also attend family dinners. And the strange, quiet peace that settled in afterward, that peace was worth more, in the end, than any amount of lobster or expensive wine my family could have ever ordered in my name without asking. If this story felt familiar to you in any way, if some part of it echoed something quietly true in your own life, I hope you'll carry this with you. It is never too late to stop paying, in whatever currency, for a love that should have been given to you freely all along.